pencil marks all lightened. Let's wet the back. Let's mix our colours. We've got some Cobalt Blue. And then we've got this lovely reddish orange colour. And then we've got the darker clouds. And then a little bit of the yellow around the sun. We don't need very much of that. Cobalt Blue for the sky. That's too bright because remember this is very early in the morning. There's still a dullness to the sky. So I'm going to add a small amount of permanent rose and a tiny amount of burnt sienna. Now this is a bit too violet. I'd like that to be a little bit more to the blue. And that's pretty good. Okay, and I've mixed quite a lot here. The big mistake people make is they just don't mix enough paint. It's always better to overmix than undermix your paint. We've got all these reflections that also need similar colours, only slightly dulled. So whatever you don't use here, you'll use when you do the reflections. So the Cad Yellow from around the sun, I'm going to just mix a small puddle there. And then we've got this lovely orangey red colour. So I'll go back to a bigger brush for that. Some Scarlet Lake and some clean Cad Orange. Needs to be a bit stronger in tone. And that's pretty good. Doesn't have to be 100% right. That's good. Put that there. And then here we've got the darker clouds. So for that, we'll go in with French Ultramarine. Some burnt sienna. A small amount of permanent rose. So the paint consistency here will be thicker than this consistency. And that's pretty good. I'm just going to leave the sun shape here white at this stage. It's such a small shape, if I need to, I can tint it later, which I probably will. The lovely thing about this reference is this beautiful warmth here. Now, if we turn this around so that it's like this, then some of this bright colour will flow into the dark rather than the other way around, and you'll preserve this bright colour. We're going to start with this red and orange and yellow. So some area has a lot of yellow around it, so let's just paint around that, leave little gaps. And wherever I see a bit of a leaning towards the yellow, I'll paint that in. Okay. Then we'll just go into our orange. That's a bit too weak. Don't keep painting till you paint it all to decide something's too weak. A bit more orange. Here I'm just lightly touching the paper. It's a bit cooler along the edge here, so I'll grab some permanent rose and add that to the mix. But I want to add a bit of water. I want it a bit lighter at the same time. If you're going to do this way, you really have to turn your photo upside down. As you move further away from the sun, the colours get a little bit cooler. So I'm adding a bit of blue, maybe a lot more blue. Paint through the distant hill, maybe a bit more orange. It's got too much red in it. In the brush, go back into the bit of yellow too. Great. Okay, so we've got the warmth, and I'm quite happy with the various transitions. Then we've got some really dark clouds. I won't use the size 16 for this, so I'm going to go in with my size 8 brush. And we're going to paint wherever I see wet on wet soft edges. Just very light shapes there. So I picked up some of this paint and then dipped my brush in water because I don't want this to be too dark. And when you paint up to objects like these figures' heads, make sure you've got the same sort of colour on either side. Use the side of the brush to create some texture. That'll do. Now I'll get some Cobalt Blue. So I'm still using my size 8 brush because this space is proving a lot smaller than I had intended. Let's put a bit of blue here. Leave lots of white paper. Just pushing the brush. Just a little bit of blue here. Good. We'll go back into this. I'm taking out about half the paint, so I don't want it to blob into the painting. Just leaving little gaps here. I don't mind if some of the dark bleeds in. these clouds here have some lovely yellows and reds in them, which is obviously coming from the sun over here. So I'll get some of the weak cad orange. Just put some of that in. Tint some of these white shapes with it. Now here I want some of this to be a bit thicker. So I'm going to pick up some of this paint, move it to a dry part of my palette, and add some more paint. Add the same colours. So French Ultramarine, Burnt Sienna, Permanent Rose. And this has to be stronger in tone than that because I haven't added any more water. Might be too strong, so I'll pick up some of this. That's looking pretty good. And then this area needs to be a little bit darker. So, a bit more paint. So do you understand the logic? If I start with this paint and move it into a dry part of my palette, you've got to make sure it's dry. If any of this moisture here flows into it, then immediately it will dilute it. But so if you do this, then it always has to be a stronger tone. Still might be a bit too strong. Okay. Some of this I'm making up, obviously, because we've changed the shape. And I put marks down expecting the watercolour to flow and help me paint the interesting shapes. There we go, something like that. Magic. If you wait too long to do this, the paint won't flow and you'll get more a clumpy look. But you can see now how we've really managed to protect this really bright mixture. I'm going to bring this in a little bit more. Great. So the only thing I'm going to do now is just do a little bit of softening here around the white area. Clean my brush. And just break up this sharp edge. Right. I think these ray lines need a little bit more warmth to them. Meaning that too yellow, so I'm going to add a bit of this red mixture. Very little paint on my brush. I don't want to create cauliflowers. And I don't want the reds to be too dramatic. You really have to watch this. This is sort of dangerous territory. Okay, so now we're going to paint the wet sand. The water's going to stay there. We do that in the next stage. All the reflections are going to be slightly duller than what we see reflecting there. And the other thing is reflections, normally they're about the same distance below the object than the object is above the horizon, except when you get all these ripples. So, which is why you see the sun reflection being much longer than what we can actually see up here. The main thing with these reflections is to make sure they're under the objects and that the colours are a little bit duller. And then when we get to here, we'll have more of this sort of cobalt blue, because what we see here is reflections of what would be up here in the sky. I'm still watching this to make sure, now that I've turned it around, that I don't end up with excess water coming down here where it meets the damp paint here. You can end up with a cauliflower. I think I've got it under control, so it's pretty right, but it's just something that you have to keep in mind. So what we have in our palette, we've got the leftover Cobalt Blue, which we didn't use a lot of, and it's already slightly dulled because I've picked up some of this red in there, and it's already mixed in with that. And the sand, it's brown, right? So I'm going to just put a little bit of raw umber in that. And just check. And that's way too dull. So I probably didn't need to even add the raw umber. So now I'll go back and add more blue. And that's better. This dark colour is pretty good. Remember, this dark paint's been there for a while, so already it's also gotten a little bit darker in tone, so you have to allow for that. But again, because of the the fact that some of the sand colour will mix in with it. We'll just add some raw umber to it, and I think that's pretty good. Maybe a little bit of burnt sienna. A little bit of burnt sienna will probably work with the colours I've used and with the way I've designed this painting. It's not always the same for every painting, so that's where you have to be a little bit brave every now and then and just try to make your own decision on whether or not to put a colour in. If it works, hey, you know it was right. If it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. It's just a bit of a painting that you can, as long as you learn from it, the painting has been a success. And then this colour here, I've got way more of it than I need, but I'll use it to sort of modify some of these other colours. So I'm going to start by painting around the sun reflection. Again, it's got to be near enough to directly below. And make sure you give it little squiggles. Don't make it too straight. Don't just paint straight down. It's a bit more yellow around it. Then we've got this sort of violet. There's a bit more red in this. And, you know, I've got lots of red in my sky, so I'm adding some red to this end of the Cobalt Blue. And remember, the colours are going to come from the sky anyway, plus the native colour of the object itself. Paint on this side as well. Add a bit of Cobalt Blue. It's a bit too strong in tone. When you're doing this stage, it's more important to be looking at your sky rather than the photo, okay? Because this is what you're actually reflecting. I still look at the photo because if I see a shape that I really like, I'll find a way to incorporate it in my painting, however. I'm sort of leaving parts of the legs unpainted. I keep coming back and keeping this leading edge nice and wet, especially around the sun. There's more red here. More red here. So this is all very wet on wet. And what I mean by wet on wet, all these marks in here are wet on wet. Obviously, this is still dry, but as soon as I wet it with a paint, it becomes a wet on wet shape. Then we've got this dark passage. Now in my painting I've got this sort of, this dark blue, navy blue shape running through there and not so much down here. So I have to remember to reflect what I've got up there. It's going to come through something like that, just to put a mark so I don't forget. I'll add a bit more blue to that mixture. There. So I'm just pushing the brush, touching that dark here and there, but also leaving a lot of this white because I want to try and capture some of this lovely light I've got here on the edge of this dark cloud. And I'm using the more blue based mix here. But it's not going to be a bright blue. Maybe add a little bit more blue to here. Oops. Actually, this is all going to be sand, damp sand here, so I'll leave that. Just lightly indicating these cloud shapes coming towards the sun. Looks a bit like a mess at the moment, but it will work. Famous last words. And here, there we go. Pretty good. Now, some of these are quite a bit darker. Now a lot of this light colour has come down and moved these darker shapes. And here we've got, I think, a dark reflection of this dark wave, which we have yet to put in. So I'm going to put that in now. Yeah. And I'm just creating sort of semi-random marks, but I know they'll flow into one another and create something that looks a little bit more natural. It's a bit too regular. See, all these rays are just starting to look a bit too structured, so I'm going to just go a bit crazy and connect some of them together. Well, it's good. Here we've got the damp sand, and for that is mainly raw umber. Maybe a little bit of burnt sienna and French ultramarine. And notice I mixed that in with the other colours that were here, which were colours from the sky anyway, so you'd always have some of that colour. And we'll make this a little bit more interesting so it's not just a straight edge. And a little bit more burnt sienna further away we get from the water's edge. And I'm going to get a little bit of this colour and put it here, just so it's already done for the next stage. Then I'll just soften these edges. So the reflections of the clouds, the white parts of the clouds here, are just going to have a dull, slightly warm colour to them. So it's mainly the Scarlet Lake and the Cad Orange and the Cad Yellow. Not a lot of water in my brush, and I'm going to go in and just soften and tint some of these shapes. Keep your spray bottle handy because you may end up needing to use it. Like break up this line. I don't want one straight line of white. Because most of them are going to be tinted by the sand colour. Now here I've lost some of these lighter cloud colours, so I'm just going to go in and drop in some of that here. Same here. I don't like these rays, they're too irregular. It's better. And then some of these I'm going to soften. So the sand's not dead flat, right? So some of these colours are going to just merge into one another. So let's just drag some of that paint down. And then here and there I might lift just a softer light. Here, while we've got a reasonably sharp edge in this case, just because of the way the waves are coming in, it's nice to break that up a little bit here and there. So I'm going to lift and just soften this edge, maybe in the distance there. Now, when you're lifting, pressure on your brush can have an impact. So it's just a light brush, and I've lifted a little bit of a highlight. If I press too hard, you can create like a sort of semi-cauliflower where you lift so much water that the paint then wants to flow back in. So I'm just really using this to just lighten a passage by a small amount. Here we've got some horizontal lines. That'll do. Look at how these shapes here on the water are just hinting at reflections of the clouds in the sky. I quite like that. Just noticed I managed to drop a drop of water right there. Luckily, I haven't painted the hill in the distance, so no damage done. I'll paint this distant hill. Just a bit of French Ultramarine, raw Umber. Any of the other colours that are in here as well can go in. Too light. If we look at the water, first it's very dark, but mainly these waves. Everything else is relatively light. But if we look at these dark waves, we can see a hint of green in them, but it's very dark and just a subtle green. Need a lot of it. So it'll be French ultramarine, lots of French ultramarine, some burnt sienna, add a little bit of this red because that, this orangey red colour, because that would be reflecting into the water. And then I'll put some Cobalt Turquoise in there as well, just to give that water just a subtle hint of green. Maybe a little bit more turquoise. And that's good enough for the initial lighter passages. I'll then have to go in stronger in tone for this area here. But I've got that sitting there. Very little water. There we go. And we'll use that for the darker waves. Okay, before I do anything else, I have to go and dry this now. I've been holding off drying it in part because I like the paint to continue to grow and develop, and you get these lovely subtle transitions from one colour to the other that I think is just so typical of watercolour. And also if I hit this with a hairdryer too soon, it tends to disturb the surface of the paint and it can really muddy it. If I look at this, most of this has lost its shine. This is just on the tail end of it, but I'll make sure I don't have the hairdryer too close to that, otherwise that would dull that. Okay, so I've really just dried the top layer. The paper's still wet underneath, so I'll pick up this colour here, take most of the paint out, and I'm going to paint distant horizon first. I'll just use the tip of my brush for that. I'm just going to use the tip. So, oops. You can leave the odd bit of white paper, that's nice too. A little bit stronger. Lighter brush strokes to leave plenty of white. Some smaller, darker waves in the distance. And then I just dip my brush in water to dilute the paint because it's relatively light toned in the foreground here. Oops. Now, if you look at the water here, you'll see that there's a hint of the red and orange from the sky. So I'm going to drop some of that colour in there. Just makes for a nice effect. Get my small brush. Just to be a bit darker still. And then at the edge of this water, there's always a little shadow. So if you look at the reference, it gets dark and it gets really dark right at the water's edge. So for that, I'll just look at maybe a blue-grey colour from here. Just quick. It's not one dark line all the way across. And now that's, so I've painted that in just to start tinting that edge, and then I'll go in with my really dark colour here. Just lift some white foamy bits. And soften some edges down below. This is a bit too yellow. We'll let that dry. And then I'm going to add a bit of yellow, orange. So I'll add some cad yellow with a little bit of cad orange. Depending on your yellow, you may not need the orange. I'll get some pure yellow. There. And leave some just white paper, and I'll soften a few of those edges. I'll break this up with a bit of the more reddish colour. Let's throw in some darker waves. Yeah. I'm always adjusting the amount of paint in my brush with my towel, by the way. It's not always easy for me to show you that. That's good. These are still not dark enough, so I'm going to mix an even thicker puddle. Lots of turquoise, lots of French ultramarine, and just a little bit of burnt sienna. It's better. This area is still wet, so rather than diluting this mix to allow for the aerial perspective, I'm just using the water that's already on the paper to effectively dilute some of these marks. Okay, I think that'll do that. Oh, that's way too big, Joe. Okay, so I'm going to use a small amount of raw umber, a little bit of Scarlet Lake for the flesh tone, just a warm brown colour. Maybe a bit thicker. Okay. Now, one of the things I've got to look at is this head is too big for that body. So I'll have to just move the body around a little bit and make it a bit wider. Let's get some Cobalt Blue. It's better. And the trousers, I'll just give them dark trousers, or shorts. Just French Ultramarine Unburnt Sienna. Not dark enough. Some dark here. Being very loose with this. I want to turn it into a painting just of figures. Two. Some raw umber, very weak. I'm going to change that. It's better. To do their reflection, I'm going to need to wet this area here, and I need really clean water for that, so I'm going to just go and get some clean water. Just a hint of a lighter area here than on the other side. Yep, be right back. Okay, so I need to wet this area so I can do their reflections, but I need to dry this better because the paper is quite damp underneath. Let me just dry it. So I've just dried this main area here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet plenty of water this way. Okay, almost to their legs, but not quite. That's because when I paint the reflection, as the reflection gets close to the object being reflected, it gets sharper and more defined. Their legs are a brownish colour, so I'll find brownish colour. Connect that way. And then for this second leg, because it's above, it won't touch it. There. And then we go into the pink for the lady. Dark shorts for the guy. And nothing too detailed either. Then a bit of the brown, orange, we can use that for the head, hint of the arms maybe. It's just enough to give a hint of the reflection, but there'll be areas of that reflection that are darker and more defined than others, so I'll just go in with a slightly stronger colour. And for the legs, just French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna, a little bit less water in my brush. There we go. And his shorts. And that's good enough for that. In the sky, we'll throw in some birds just to make it look a bit more interesting, even though I think it's already quite a dramatic sky. But the birds help direct the eye. Remember, we want the viewer to keep looking into our painting. So I'm going to have one bird here, maybe up here, flying in. Another little one here. Oops. There. Another one over here. And we could, just for interest's sake, and to show you how I do it, we'll put in a few just seagulls or birds in the sand. And because they've got long, thin legs, you can't always see their legs. So so leave a little gap and just drag the paint down like that. And then I'll put another couple over here. Here we go. Oops. Not quite finished yet, but let's sign it anyway. There isn't any seaweed on this, but I'm going to throw some on there just to further help direct the eye around our painting. So I'll just get some burnt sienna. French ultramarine. Oh, maybe a bit strong, Joe. Take some paint out of my brush. Just hinting at some seaweed or something like that. It's too refined. There we go. And then some of these little highlights, we'll just turn them into pebbles by putting a dark mark underneath. Not all of them. If we look at the reference, there's a bit more of a subtle transition between the water and the wet sand. So just one last little thing. Get a cool shadow. So just some Cobalt Blue, a little bit of permanent rose. Not being too particular about it, I'm mixing it in with where all this other paint is. Dilute that a bit. It's stronger here. It's just a subtle thing, but okay. That's it, folks.